Iran's regime continues to crack down on protests across the country that are now in their fourth week. Human rights groups say at least 185 people, including 19 children, have been killed, hundreds injured, and thousands arrested by security forces. And escalating the crisis for Tehran further, workers at refineries crucial for Iran's oil and natural gas production are also walking off their jobs this week in solidarity. So what comes next in these protests, and how should countries like the U.S. and Canada respond? Morgan Ortagus served as the U.S. State Department spokesperson in former President Donald Trump's administration. Hi, Ms. Ortagus. Good to meet you. Good to have you on our program.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start off with your assessment of what's going on inside Iran right now. And in particular, we have witnessed protests in Iran before, back in 2019, even as recently as then. Do you sense, like so many have been telling us, that this is different?
I hope it's different. It's hard to know because we did see the Green Revolution and what came of that in the early days of the Obama administration. Similar, as you pointed out, fall of 2019, we saw whenever I was at the State Department under Mike Pompeo, the Iranian government brutally cracked down on those protests. It's hard to get the exact numbers, but we thought there was about 1,500 who were murdered by the regime, 10,000 imprisoned. This one, I think, is different in the sense that you're seeing so many more images of young women around the country that are standing up and protesting. Obviously, we've seen horrific images of some of them being beaten up and killed by the authorities, by the so-called religious police and the Baji and other entities in Iran. But I think certainly it pulls at the heartstrings of all of us around the world anytime you see people peacefully protesting, but this time especially because you have so many young women and teenage girls that are now taking to the streets to fight for their rights.
Yeah, I wondered what you thought of the impetus for these protests. The fact that it was a 22-year-old, young woman who was just charged with wearing her hijab improperly, and the way in which that in and of itself has really, gripped people right around the world.
Yeah, Mahsa Amini lost her life for the crime of showing her hair. And I think that is something that is just intolerable for the women of Iran. It's intolerable for so many of us when we see this happening. What's really important, I think, is that we stand in solidarity with these women. I mean, it's basically gender apartheid going on in Iran right now. And what these women need is not only for us to uplift their voices, to shine a light on what's happening as you are doing, but what these women also need is for Western governments, this includes Canada and the United States and others, not to empower their oppressors. So whenever you give sanctions relief or whenever you refuse to condemn or to make the IRGC Quds Force a terrorist organization, you are giving support to the very oppressors for the women that we all claim to be helping and supporting.
Let me dive into the idea of classifying it or listing the IRGC as a whole as a terrorist organization. The Quds Force here is listed as a terrorist entity, but the government has so far resisted listing the organization as a whole. And most of the reason that we've been provided when we ask why is around the ability to enforce that level of sanctions. So, for example, that might include a sweeping number of people who have been conscripted or who are related to those who have been and are already in Canada. Like, it's just, we don't have the sanctions infrastructure. And to that point, I should say last week, the government here announced money, I think more than $76 million to strengthen that capacity. But their argument is that that infrastructure doesn't exist at this point. Explain to us how in the United States it works. And if your assessment is now a few years into that listing, if it's been effective.
So we're 20 years after 9/11, and after 9/11 in the United States, we created at the Treasury Department and a whole of government approach, but specifically at the U.S. Treasury Department, the ability to go after terrorist organizations and people who fund them. So after 20 years, I don't think that there's a really good excuse for any Western government not to have the capability and the ability to do so. We have had the IRGC designated since May 2019. That was actually one of the first announcements I made as State Department spokesperson. And so there's certainly, when there is capacity and the will, we can get something like this done. And so what's more importantly, too, is whether it is designating the IRGC as the terrorist. Canada also has the capability to look into many shady Iranian politicians and figures who have wealth and who have land in Canada. I mean, the thing that we have to stop doing in the United States, Canada, all Western governments, we shouldn't allow Iranian officials and their children, the families, to be educated and to benefit from the West while they are cracking down on their own people and killing young women for showing a little bit of their hair. So it takes more than hashtags. It takes more than talking about leading with human rights. If you're really going to lead with human rights, and if you're really going to help these women, you're going to stop the funding of the people, of the entities who are oppressing these women in Iran. Hashtags don't matter if they are still getting billions of dollars in sanctions relief.
And when you refer to sanctions relief, what specifically are you referring to? Like what changes do you want to see?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on right now. Right now, the United States government is doing a very bad job of enforcing the sanctions that are on the books. China and other states have been able to purchase Iranian oil on the black market. And so we saw a contraction in 2019 and 2020 during our maximum economic pressure campaign against Iran. We saw a contraction of their budget and their economy. So they had to make, we forced the government to make real choices about if they were going to invest in public health infrastructure, let's say, or if they were going to fund the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah, to fund terrorist organizations and entities around the world. We know that the IRGC has had a greater budget this year because they have not felt that financial pressure from the United States and other Western governments. And if we were to go back into the JCPOA, which is the Iran nuclear deal, the Iranian government could benefit as much as $1 trillion over the next decade, $1 trillion.
And I certainly do take your point about the effect of those sanctions and not enforcing them. My guess is, and with respect, of course, the challenge that you're a Republican, that Democrats would pose is that even with maximum pressure, Iran ended up restarting its nuclear program. And even with, for example, all those sanctions that hurt its economy, we are still seeing the human rights atrocities committed that we were before, even to perhaps some would argue a greater degree right now. So is the campaign you speak of even that effective?
I think it's certainly effective because you start to strangle the lifeblood of the regime, which is the money, right? We actually saw, and this has been well documented and reported in open sources in 2019 and 2020, especially 2020. Hezbollah had to lay off many fighters. They weren't able to give them the cash that they needed, the money that they needed in order to fight. We saw a contraction in their budget. The IRGC certainly had a contraction in their budget because the government did writ large. So, you have to force the government to make real choices. And I would say you're totally right that sanctions is just one piece and like a whole toolbox of things that you can have to try and curb the illicit behavior of the Iranian regime. Sanctions in and of itself, anywhere around the world, are not going to completely force a change. But what you hope that you do is not to empower the oppressor, to force those people back to the negotiating table. And the West has to set a standard about when and how they will do business with the country. The West, and this includes the United States, and I've worked for Republicans and Democrats. I worked for President Obama as his treasury attaché in his first term in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia. So Republicans, Democrats, Western governments, it's really going to take a lot more than just hashtags and just voicing our solidarity with the Iranian people. I think that's very important. I think the Iranian women need to see all of us talking about this around the world. But what won't be effective is if we voice support, but again, still enable their oppressors to do what the IRGC has done this year, which is to purchase more safe houses where they reportedly take their political prisoners and torture them, rape them, and execute them.
Okay, Ms. Ortagus, I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.